Welcome to the Medic Materials Podcast. If you're here for buttoned-up EMS professionalism and HR-approved opinions, you're in the wrong damn place. We talk real EMS, talk about some fucked-up calls, bad decisions, some system bullshit, and the stuff you only admit in the truck at 3 a.m. We will absolutely try to sell you some merch. Thank you very much. Accidentally teach you something. Maybe occasionally say something smart in between the sarcasm. So kick the kids out, let's turn it up, and prepare to be mildly offended. Let's get into it.
Hello and welcome everyone back to the Medic Materials Podcast. I am excited for today. For the first time, I think ever, I divulged the secret of what we were talking about to Emily. How do you feel about that, Em? Are you scared?
Are you serious?
I did. I had to.
I was with you for 16 hours yesterday and you didn't tell me a thing.
I know, because I'm such a horrible human being. But I figured, I wanted to have this conversation after a recent call. It spurred some thoughts of like, hey, we should talk about this because we've never actually talked about this subject in this amount of specific detail on the show before. Inside calls we have, but never just by itself. And I reached out to Emily because at the time she was the only person that I could rely on to be like, hey, give us information about this subject. Because, my wife won't help me and her dad ain't sure going to help me. So even though I'm still trying, but that's like, trying to keep snow in hell. So that's never going to happen. So, I reached out to Emily and was like, we're going to do this. And then what did you say to me, Em, that you were petrified or something?
Yeah, I said that's a terrifying thought.
It is what it is, though. I think, as we go into the discussion today, there's going to be a lot of interesting things brought up that if people haven't gone to certain classes and utilize certain things and are part of fire departments, they don't exactly know anything about this subject. So I'm gonna give Emily the floor.
Certified badass.
Hey, you finally heard it?
I did hear that.
Cool. Maybe I need to way up high on the levels so you guys can hear it through the computer. Em, you've now been flying for how long?
2 years, 3 days ago.
Good for you.
Congratulations.
Right? Congratulations. Jess, I think this is her 14th year in the air.
So cool.
Something like that. Her dad, I think, is going on 24 or 25. So you'll totally get there. But I bring that up specifically because we are going to be talking all about HEMS utilization and aircraft in EMS. So Helicopter EMS, which is what HEMS stands for. Megan, thank you again for joining as the intern. You were actually on the one call that sparked this conversation. So it'll be interesting to see what your thoughts are as, an EMT for so long, but then also the intern. But I want to welcome for people who are watching us on the interwebs and not just listening. You're like, who the hell is this guy above Turek's head? This is Steve. I am going to say that he is my HEMS expert, secondarily to Miss Megan, or not Miss Megan, Miss Emily this morning, whatever. I need to start drinking. See, I'm tripping over words. I need to buzz myself already. It's awful. But I'm gonna ask him a bunch of questions today, and he's gonna be able to answer me, hopefully with some astounding information to kind of help people understand like where things are in New York State in like the Heems world. Because I was doing a little bit of research, and surprising enough to me, with New York City, there's only four helicopter companies in this state that I'm aware of that I found on the internet. And that again with New York City, like I was expecting there be more, right? Not saying that there's not a lot of bases, but there's only four companies that cover the entire state, including New York City. And we're not here to sit there and pin one against each other, or, be like, this one's the best or that one's the best. I could care less. What I want to know is, utilization, safety around aircraft, when to use them, when not to use them. We'll talk about cost a little bit too, because I think that's a big hang up. And, the general public just has even EMS public has like a misnomer of how much it actually costs to operate. And then we'll kind of, filter out wherever the conversation goes. So let me get through the rig check, and then we'll get started here. So again, I just want to remind everybody, stop sitting on your hands and, just death clicking the CME presentations that your agency gives you because they buy EMS One or, Target Solutions or whatever. That's crap. You're not learning anything. You're doing nothing but wasting time. So come and listen to us banter and joke and tell terrible, dirty jokes and get CMEs that way. So check out medic-materials.com, and that'll take you to the CME Academy. You can learn all about how your agency or you as an individual can get CME credit through Medic Materials. Conference alert number 2. The previous conference is now over. I want to thank everybody who came up out to Geneva, New York to visit and take all the presentations. There was a bunch of people that listened to the show that went there just to like take presentations that I was giving. And I thought that was really cool. It was a humbling moment. And I just want to say thank you to those people because I know you're listening. But the next alert is come and meet me. I am presenting one time on pediatrics at the PAC conference, the Primary Assessment Conference in Lake Placid, May 13th through the 17th. I am the last day in the morning. So save the best for last. I want to shout out our listeners in France and the state of Louisiana. So thank you again for listening to all of our nonsense. So, Steve, I'm gonna go right to you here. When you think and when you talk to people about like HEMS utilization and what like HEMS is, right? Helicopter EMS. What do you normally tell them in terms of like, this is what we are and this is what we do kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to preface it with a really unsatisfying answer, and that sort of depends on your zip code, right? Um, I've worked in environments where there's almost no indication just because of the proximity to like, a primary or a thrombectomy capable stroke center, and then, a shift a week later at a different agency. That's like your lifeline to try and bust the windows for a meaningful outcome for that same patient presentation, right? But moving away from that disclosure, I think the short answer is time and tools. What is the time to get that patient to definitive specialty care? If we can, sort of move past the idea of stabilization at, a hospital that probably isn't really equipped or comfortable stabilizing a patient of that severity or specialty. What is the workflow in getting that patient somewhere that can actually tend to their needs in a definitive manner? Whether it be actual time on ground or time to a local hospital, and then all the hurdles to get them transported and transferred to that facility. And then I think the second equally important consideration is tools. What does it look like in getting that patient by ground with your tools as a ground paramedic or an EMT to a facility capable of stabilizing them or stabilizing them during that trip versus what's available with what ETA by the aircraft? In New York State, especially now over the past few years, blood is a huge component of that conversation. And I think one of the other things that we'll probably have to get into is as we see more ventilators, sapphire pumps, other modalities come into ground 911 paramedicine. I think the conversation also has to be what's the value offering of a ground paramedic with that tool, and what's the value offering of a flight paramedic with that tool. Like, are we maximizing it just because we had the Hamilton T1? Are we equipped to use it to its full potential, in so much as it means a good outcome for that patient? Or are we in a better place to, do our initial stabilization to the maximum of our comfort as a ground paramedic, and then hand off to a critical care crew with a pretty diverse background and like heavier education, admittedly, in most cases, to then finish it off, do the real stabilization and get them to that center.
Right. How about you here?
I totally agree. Actually, 2 points you brought up that were really that had stuck out of my mind. It depends on your zip code, and I think that was a culture shock for me because I did EMS in the same area my entire career. And then when I took a flight job, I went and flew somewhere that I did not do ground EMS, which was one of the best things I could have done. It's not the same. It's not the same at all. So I think, depending on your zip code and what your local resources are, but also like how well are you at using the tools? Steve hit the nail on the head with that. We can all be trained in a T1, but how well are we all trained in a T1 or whatever the tool is? So, there's a difference between the cardiac arrest reversal, that's the easiest thing to ventilate, versus the 22-year-old that just went to arrest for an asthma attack. And if you're not comfortable managing both, then find somebody who is, type of thing.
Yeah, and I have to piggyback on specifically like the vent and the skills, right? Because everybody knows my wife is a flight nurse, flight paramedic, and her and I will have conversations and be like, okay, she kind of brought up the same thing of like, more and more agencies are having the similar tools to what she has on the helicopter. But what is vastly different is the education in how to use them. She receives so much more education behind her skills than I do on the ground. And that's why, she's Billy Badass and I'm just whatever on the ground. And you can see that educational difference in any time that you like interact with the flight crew. Doesn't matter what company they're in New York State. They all have similar education backgrounds. And I think, that is where, hey, they got a cool ride. Hey, they got cool tricks. Hey, they got this, but they have the education to back it up and be different. And I think that's what people, tend to forget is they're not just the quick ride. They're not just the blood products, but they're the education behind it. Right.
And the practical skills and frequency, right? I'm a ground paramedic by trade. I didn't fly before I went into like the logistics side of aeromedical. So I never had the direct benefit of going through like the orientation and the third rider process in that critical care world. It wasn't until, I was working per diem in an ALS system where I got my first exposures to vents as a clinician. Um, I feel really lucky in the education, the quality we get there, and like the labs we do, things of that nature. Uh, but the question also has to be, even if you're in one of those rare, fortunate situations of a really good, like education, culture, underground agency with those tools, do you have the frequency of independently managing those patients to be really good at it and really comfortable with it when you get that patient population,
Yeah.
right? Some of those calls sort of can define our careers as ground providers. And a lot of times that's fairly routine day to day for what the flight crew is seeing, just because of the nature of their activation and the criteria for them to show up in the first place.
Yeah. And one of the funniest things that, Jess and I spoke about, and this was years ago, was I get called for everyone's bad day. She gets called for my bad day. And,
Yeah.
like when you think about it, like they're our lifeline for a lot of things. Like, hey, I do not have the tools, knowledge, or resources or pucker factor left to be able to deal with what I have in front of me. I'm going to hand it off to somebody who sees more of this than I do. So I think that's a huge thing is, she does more IVs than I do every year. She does more tubes than I do every year. She does more, you know, specific med pushes than I do every single year for a decade. I think she's way more proficient in doing certain things than I would be on the ground. Yeah, so proficiency of skills, I think, is something where, again, we're not thinking about that as ground providers. We call them mostly because we want a quick ride or we're scared, right? Would anybody disagree with, like, I'm generalizing, but I feel like ground providers as a whole tend to go, well, I don't want to drive to a certain hospital because it's 45 minutes and I'd rather them fly it. Or it's a stroke and they need to get there quicker and I'm an hour and a half away. Or, oh my God, I don't want to deal with this. Let's let them do it. I mean,
I
that's where
think
my
I
brain.
think more than scared, I would just say self-aware, right? Um, Again, sort of a hobbyist ground paramedic anymore. I don't have that, same comfort and experience that I did when I was working full time. And thinking back to some of the recent cases where like I've personally called for medevac out, a lot of it is just recognition of like I could quickly be in over my head
Mhm.
in the immediate future, right? This patient. I don't necessarily have like all the tools I want to fully manage the airway. And do I really feel good about doing a 45-minute, hour and a half trip with this patient on the vent and negotiating that, fighting that worst case scenario? And oh, by the way, what's like the predicate injury or mechanism of illness that led us into this mess in the first place? Like, does that get better and truly stabilize with what I'm doing here? Or is there really that indication for the time of like, okay, instead of, 45-minute ground pound through the hills, 15-minute flight transport to
Mhm.
that same destination? So
Agreed.
when I look at it as the ground provider there, that's sort of what I'm looking at. Do I have the tools to reasonably manage this? And does the patient need a better time proposition than what I can offer, even if I do have those tools?
Yeah. Yeah. Megan, anything you want to add in your listening to the conversation as it unflows here? Because you're acting somewhat like Phil right now, and I want to get you interjected here.
Listening. And I
I
don't know what
know that
call we're
that's the
talking
problem.
about. So I don't know what call we're talking about. So
Oh, well, that's okay. You'll understand here shortly when I start talking about time. Um,
a couple weeks ago.
yes.
Okay, I know exactly what we're talking about. And
Um,
to that point, I think Steve is very nice in saying that people are just being self-aware. I really do think that people are scared. Um,
I've been scared and I've called the helicopter. I'll be the first one to admit it.
and yeah,
Um,
sure, they are, 100% self-aware that they are scared and
yep.
that this is probably above what they are, in their head at that time able to manage for the length of time. Um, I've been on calls where we 100% formulated a plan around having a helicopter and then that helicopter canceled in the air. So we have to, um, pivot right then and there as we're going down the mountain because we have an hour and 25-minute transport to a hospital. Um, I 100%, um, I think that they're at the EMT level. I think that there is this stigma around helicopters that we don't want to bother them because they're so much better than us and will be, um,
First of
what?
all normal humans. Second of all, we all just want to fly. For the love of God, call us. We just want to get in the air.
I didn't even have to finish my statement, and that's exactly why I said it. Thank you,
I
Emily.
I swear that's Emily's new sticker is we just want to fly.
Right.
Just but I will bring it up to your point is like at a BLS level, you don't know what you don't know. So why not call resources? You know, like your closest ALS, not specifically in our area, but the closest ALS could be a helicopter. And that's totally okay.
Yes. 100%. I have had that situation.
That's totally fine. Like we will be there. Have no fear. It does not matter what the call is. We will be there.
Mm-hmm. So
Yeah, and not to mention, I think it's helpful to look at it through the lens of like, okay, flight crew specifically, they're getting paid to be there, right? Like, across New York State, we have a lot of volunteers, so that isn't necessarily true for the ground people. But the flight crew is getting paid to be there, whether they're flying or not. Like, let's look at it from what is the impact for that patient, right? What's the best case scenario with that patient, them getting that access? And more importantly, what's worst case? Like, you get a 3 a.m. sideways glance because, maybe it didn't turn out to be the catastrophe that you thought it was. Um, Considering the alternative, like, yeah, make the call. But that's one of the conversations that I have a lot, day to day, is the idea of like, tapping out a resource. Not that it's impossible, but especially when we're talking about New York, I mean, there's a pretty good network of coverage across the state. And I'm sure Emily can, give the same confidence here. When you call your closest helicopter not available, like that's getting bounced to the next one almost immediately, real time, right? Just because your friendly neighborhood critical care helicopter is already out on another mission or down for maintenance, whatever the case may be, it doesn't live and die with them because they're already helping someone else. You know, and when we're talking about the distances for a neighboring base, sure, maybe that's 50 nautical miles, but that's not an ambulance ground response, right? They're not stopping for red lights. They're not taking the scenic route there. It is straight line distance at some serious speed so that it's feasible to get them there.
especially if they have a
And especially as a ground provider, like you've got one mess at a time,
Mhm.
hopefully. Uh,
Yeah.
Worry about that. Let the dispatchers, let the coordinators, let someone else figure out the next patient down. There's likely a resource. Do what's best for your patient.
And it's funny that you bring that up because most of the three major ones in New York, let me put it this way, for the HEMS, all will dispatch the closest helicopter regardless of whose asset that is. So my company will send the closest helicopter, whether that's my company or not. And I believe all three in all, I
All
should
four,
say,
in my experience, yeah.
yes. So like it's not your job to be like, I want this helicopter. You got enough to worry about.
Mhm.
All you have to do is worry about the patient and recognize that you need help. That is it. Above and beyond that, help is coming.
Right. And one of the things that I want, this is a note from Gerard. He said it in other episodes, and I think it rings true. Him and I talk about it when we do our MCI lectures for CMEs and EMT students is think about the helicopters as a commodity to use, right? But they're also in limited supply. There's only so many across the state. So request them, hold on to them until you're absolutely sure you don't need it, right? If you don't request it, then that commodity goes to somebody else and you might be hung out to dry wanting it, needing it, but not having it because everybody's, doing a MCI in New York City. Who knows, right? Um, Gerard will tell um, in that same class, he did a call where he requested multiple aircraft to the scene. One of his buddies, which turned out to be on the other side of like 5 counties over, was also requesting helicopters for their really bad accident. But because Gerard requested earlier, he got 3 helicopters going to him, and his buddy got bupkis because everybody in that area was busy. And if you think about it like a commodity, there's only so many. Yes, you're going to get one, right? But if you don't call, then you're never going to know if you're going to get one or not, right?
So can I add something
Yep.
from
Oh,
the
you are not allowed to talk, Megan.
Okay. So from the education perspective, though, and I'm not justifying, I'm not saying it's right at all, but when we are taught to call ALS. We automatically, like we just say the term, call for ALS. And we as providers automatically think about ground paramedics. I don't think that there's enough education, enough specific conversation around including a helicopter in that.
Well, I mean, and when you're talking about BLS providers, and I, say that I have this really messed up airway and I'm an EMTB on my ambulance, so there is not a whole lot I can do. My closest my closest ALS could be a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
I agree with you.
Absolutely.
I do think that the verbiage has to change because, when 10,000 years ago when I went to EMT class, it's called ALS and, the paramedic can't come and maybe I'm not talking about a paramedic.
It's still that way, Emily. It's still that way. So like my higher level of care as an EMT is a paramedic or a hospital if they're closer. The higher level of care for a paramedic, they automatically think about a helicopter, hopefully, or if they're not calling for a second paramedic. So I think at the EMT level, the conversation needs to change and get more specific about including helicopters.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's hard because I mean, I imagine there's a healthy number of people listening to this right now whose heads are about to lift fully off of their shoulders, who probably went like an entire career without ever considering calling a helicopter because they have that proximity to a tertiary center or a level two or the thrombectomy capable or the primary capable, where it's just not in their vernacular, right? So it's reasonable that we don't see heavy instruction or guidance on sort of what informs medevac usage in your actual education program. But I think it's important, just like any other resource utilization for your specific agency, right? Because again, like the indications and the utilization can vary so greatly from, again, zip code to zip code to go back to that. But I think the other point I want to make from what you guys are saying was like from a commodity resource, I don't know that we should be treating medevac as any different than making a resource request for ALS or for a second ALS truck or police, fire police, whatever the case may be. Ultimately, the scene scenario or the patient's clinical condition dictate a need. Ask for the resource.
Yeah.
That's why the 911 centers exist. That's why, the medevac comm center exists. Let them figure it out. I don't think any of us are working in, a resource rich environment where we've got three other paramedics, EMTs and fire crews sitting there with us, such that we have time to sit down and look at the map and see, oh, well, let's think about this, right?
Right.
None of us work in that realm. Recognize the resource, express the resource need. And to put another spin on this, I think a lot of the decision making outside of just like bad dispatch information or, poor information going into the dispatch center more specifically is these requests like to do like an air medevac scene intercept properly. The request should be originating from the dispatch information whenever possible. I know there's a lot of pushback depending on, what county you work in, and it's, has a bad reputation depending on who you talk to. But at the end of the day, it should be no different than like priority dispatching to indicate a paramedic response, right?
Mm-hmm.
Dispatch center on a good day is getting information immediately that can give some healthy insight into what that patient's condition is or what the mechanism of injury was that led them to this situation. Once they're done dispatching fire, EMS, police, whatever the case may be, paramedic versus BLS response, realistically, if it's indicated, they should be giving the local air crew a heads up too.
Yeah.
Why
Yeah,
waste 10 minutes of a response time where that crew en route could again understand what resources are available? Is the weather clear enough for it to even fly? Is it even a legitimate option? Such that by the time you're making patient contact, the conversation is where and how do we intercept?
Mm-hmm.
Not starting the conversation of like, shit, is there even a helicopter that's available to come? And what's their ETA relative to transport to the primary center or the critical access hospital, right? Like, why not allow that math and that, consideration to happen during the response time rather than during your primary assessment or, starting like critical stabilizing care?
Now, I know I'm going to ruffle feathers here and I might make Steve's head blow off. I know I'm going to ruffle Emily's feathers with this one, What are your guys' thoughts of the people who have automatic standby policies where, hey, this gets dispatched and the aircraft gets put on standby and they're like, okay, rah, 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 and the paramedic or EMTs cancel them before even arriving on scene? What's your guys' thoughts on that?
I was going to piggyback off of, yeah.
So I think I'm going to reject the premise. I don't know. Like, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. Like, I've seen it. I just don't know that it happens with a frequency enough for my feathers to get ruffled.
You might be working
And
with the
I
wrong
don't think
area.
I'm gonna. I don't
Going
think I'm
back to
gonna
zip
like
code.
throw away good in pursuit of perfect, right? Would do I think it's like patient centric and a good practice to not cancel a resource until you understand like the clinical and operational picture you're facing? Yeah. Are we ever gonna get like 100%?
No.
No.
And that
So
and that would be unrealistic
yeah.
for me to be like, hey, we're gonna perfect this system. Like that's never gonna happen.
I mean, hey, how to go at it? Like, I'm not gonna look a gift horse in the mouth. I just don't know that we're gonna get there. Um, there's always gonna be impediments. People are gonna have opinions. I mean, I still go to EMS advisory meetings where there are legitimate conversations as to whether it's, necessary to activate a paramedic unit from dispatch for a seizure, because they have BLS and there's not enough paramedics, right? There's always going to be similar conversations across different disciplines and like levels of care. That may not like be up to the standard of care, may not be in the best interest, even though they have good intentions. Um, sure, you should probably wait to get a good clinical picture of your patient. I just don't know that that's like a practice frequent enough for me to get hot and bothered by it.
Honest answer from Steve. Megan, you wanted to chime in or no? She's like, I'm deciding whether I want to yell at
So
you.
not only just before they get to the scene, but um not the appropriate level of care provider canceling them because they were the first ones there. I
So
don't know how to.
I will say that that did happen to me at one point, in that I had a CFR cancel an aircraft before I arrived as the paramedic unit. And
Yeah.
then I get there and I'm like, oh no, this has to fly. Like I'm out in the sticks of Timbuktu here. We should totally fly this, going back to zip code. And I had to request them back. And it's like, well, now we all look stupid.
So
Well, you're lucky you got them back.
I was very lucky I got them back, but it doesn't always happen, you
that's
know?
an educational downfall there, right? Like I think that they don't know. So like that would be a good, if that was on my ground ambulance, I'd go and be like, hey, let's do some education with them to be like, this is what we're looking for, this is what we're flying. Like, let's assess the patient first. Or if you're not sure, just wait for the next person. Like, I think that that is just like a training deficit, if you will.
And I mean, it could be most things that we talk about are educational
Yeah.
deficits, right?
Oh, yes.
So going and switching gears here, you kind of alluded to it, Steve, in your opening statement, but I want to start getting into like the specifics of utilization, right? So when should we be requesting? I know like distance and things like zip code, we come back to a lot because uh, if I'm in one area of the county that I provide care in, I am like, unless it's an MCI, I am never calling a helicopter because the distance between myself and the ER that's appropriate, right? But in the other side of the county I work in, I've frequently used them because there's a distance need there where I can save time and get them there to the appropriate center with time saved. So, you know,
Well, I think it's important to, and one thing I is become very evident for me as a paramedic intern in that county. Most of the time, I don't even know where I am, honestly. I'm thinking about the call. I'm thinking about what I'm going to do when I get there. What are the interventions that I'm going to need to take? And thank God I have him with me because most times I don't know where I am, what direction the hospital is. I'm just being honest. So it's very important to know where you are and your transport time to definitive care, whatever that might be. And that might seem like a very like obvious statement, but I never really felt that until my internship.
But
No,
that is
and
so
I feel
true.
that in my soul, right? Again, I'm hired and hopefully and maintained in my paramedic role for my clinical acumen, right? It's definitely not for my geographic familiarity. Like, thank God for offline maps and the atlas I keep in my work bag, because otherwise there are parts of that county it's not going to happen. Right? Like, we're all out of
Thank
luck.
you.
Uh,
I'm glad it's not
but
just me.
no, trust me, not for lack of trying. It just no,
We all
no.
get lost. It's fine.
Google, take the wheel. But
Seriously.
I think I'm a big systems guy, right? I think if we're evaluating things, everything in the moment, and like it's the first time, that leaves a lot of room for vulnerability. Um, at the risk of being a dead horse, I really think it come from that system level of looking at it. And I think one area the auto standby policies don't generally hit is variances within one county, right? Because like you said, if you're in that one half of the county, that is a much different utilization case for like a stroke, for example, than if you're down on the other, where you have a much more reasonable access to like definitive stroke care. Um, and I think looking at that with like eyes wide open, bringing in the different agency leads and having conversations about, okay, what is our utilization today? How much of it is sort of ad hoc or at the provider discretion, and how much of that can reasonably be taken in to say, okay, based off, for New York's example, probably the fire district is a really good way to look at it as far as like accessibility with the CAD run cards and things of that nature, to say, okay, in this fire district, because of the proximity or lack thereof to a tertiary center specific to a stroke or cardiac, neuro, pediatric, maybe the cards look a little bit different, right? We're not going to hit 100%. Like, there's going to be those cases where we're going to get a few extra indication or activations that may not be fully indicated. But I think you can have reasonable discussions with all the data out there with these CAD systems, the EPCRs and everything else. You get a few people in a room for an afternoon and go through those cards, go through the EPCRs and see what like the severity looks like historically. I think you can get a pretty healthy starting point such that we can take off that mental load from the responding EMTs and paramedics or even fire departments to say like, okay, reasonable suspicion. And while you're in out, XYZ aircraft said they have a 25-minute plus lift, or scary cloud in the sky, try again later. So at least that way it's a mental offload. You guys can focus on prepping on the way. You understand what resources are available going into that patient care scenario.
Yeah,
I
and
like that.
the ability to change based off of data is significant. So, I worked one area of New York State that had a standby policy, and we were constantly getting like grandma would fall for, literally from a seated position from her wheelchair onto the floor, and it was an alpha BLS for a lift assist, but air medical was getting put on standby for that every single time. And I'm just like, for like, I understand if she fell like out the first story window, but literally a foot fall, give me a break. And eventually that went away because, like you said, people got in a room and said, do we really need to be utilizing air medical for standby for this specific dispatch? And it eventually went away. So yeah, things can change and we can add, we're going to utilize it here and we're going to put it on standby for there, but we're not going to do it for this. And those conversations can happen. And people can affect that change. So
I think it's super important that they happen with some regularity, right? Even if we stop and we think about like our collective work areas, response areas over, let's say, post COVID, the amount that has changed just in the capabilities of our local hospitals is pretty insane, right? And not for the best in most
Right.
areas. I mean, if we think about L&D services at some of these hospitals, or who has, primary versus thrombectomy, like all those changes, it can happen quickly. And then that's even before considering, what is the level of paramedic availability? Do we have more staffing? Do we have less? Do we have new tools? You know, it's dynamic and it should be treated as such. I mean, I think there's really good opportunity for the clinical leaders in any county and the people who actually understand how it functions from a system perspective behind the dispatch consoles. Those people sitting down in a room for an afternoon once a year, that can make a huge difference, right? That's where the auto standby policy goes from being sort of a bad joke because we get, the fall from standing height because, someone once upon a time thought, the risk of, you know, anticoagulant and plus the head injury at the nursing home was good cause. Maybe not quite as relevant. Maybe not the indication that we need in 2026.
Right.
But
So
that's part of medicine. It's always changing. We just have to keep up with it.
Right.
yeah. So give me a rundown for, we have a lot of students, a lot of new providers that listen to us, as you guys know, and maybe they've never had the opportunity to like call for a helicopter or been on a crew that, calls for a helicopter. What would you say is like and again, I preface this with every situation is going to dictate a little differently, right? What we're going to talk about is situational for everything, based off of resources and clinical judgment. But if there needed to be like a written list, hey, these are things that you should be thinking about if you see, consider air medical. What would you say is that list?
Oh gosh. I don't know if it's really like, oh, if you see brain matter, call a helicopter, as much of like your comfort level. If you
Again, situational, but like
call us, that's like I'm we're just there to help. I don't know. I
well,
mean,
I guess what I'm getting at is like, what are the types of like patients that meet the helicopter criteria, right? Um, are we looking at it for, you know, certain patients over a certain distance for time, or a certain patient like a stroke patient over a seizure patient, or like is there patient populations that you would, again, situationally, whatever, but like I think like, okay, if my drive time is an hour and a half and I have an MI patient, I probably would like to fly that MI patient based off of time and their condition, right? If I have a angina patient that doesn't have ST elevations, I'm probably not going to fly that patient the hour and a half because it's not time critical at that point. Like, so I guess that's where I'm getting at. Like, am I still confusing?
So I'll take the bait on this. I
The
think
time
Emily
is
will follow
tissue
me into battle.
thing.
I'm going to say hemodynamic instability. Like I don't like saying, oh, STEMI yes, stroke no, seizure no. It just doesn't work. And I think at the root of it, it comes down to again, sort of what impact can be made for that patient. What are sort of the value offerings between a ground paramedic on the New York State collaborative protocols versus a critical care crew. And when I think of that, I'm thinking, that patient who just is not adequately perfusing, either due to, a pump issue, pipe issue, whatever the case may be, and what can I reasonably impact to stabilize them on the way to the hospital. And I think admittedly, outside of, fluid balls and some pressors, we're a little limited on that compared to what we might like to believe in New York State, right? Um, Depending on the etiology, when we look at our flight crews, again, blood has become the standard, right? That's going to beat pasta water every time when we're talking perfusion issues. And I think they just generally have a much more aggressive formulary that'll allow them to make a difference in a very short term. Um, which is relevant, especially when we talk about some of the gripes with on-scene times. It's not because they're sitting around and catching up with the boys and girls from the fire department, right? Uh, they're bringing a whole host of tools and equipments that just are not available on the ground in New York State. such that they don't need to, load and go, right? They're getting in the back of your ambulance, they're getting themselves comfortable, they're getting a good report from that initial treating crew, and then they're going to put those tools to work. They're going to get them stable before they leave, right? And I think that's the biggest indication for me is that hemodynamic stability and my ability to make an impact on it as a ground provider reasonably for the duration of my transport.
Mhm.
And I think if there's any sort of culpability or vulnerability in any part of that chain, I'm really leaning towards activating the medevac.
All right, Em, it's your turn to
Can I
charge.
add to that? Can I add to that real quick?
Sure.
And also, like where we work, can I call a doc if I need them on the way? I may not be able to because I may not, I mean, at a very basic level, may not have cell service.
Right. And what a lot of people don't realize is that, just as well as we call like, your medical control doc, the aircraft crews have them as well. The flight teams have their own medical control physicians that they're going to call. So, with all of these tools and considerations that they have, they also can go, "Hey, doc, I am in this situation. It might not be in our protocol because yes, they have completely different protocols than we do, right? For the same stuff, different set of guidelines. Um that doc might tell them, okay, we'll do X, Y, and Z, and we don't even have XYZ capabilities.
Right.
That was a big eye opener when my wife started flying in learning all of the capabilities and just the amount of meds that she carries and the amount of like one type of med that she carries, like she carries X amount of pressors. I carry one, right? It's like, okay, well, if my one doesn't work, oh, well, she can go, well, I carry one for this and one for this, and this is the first line for this. And if that doesn't work, I carry this one. And, you know, they have options. I think options is the bigger term for that too. And
It
Emily,
goes back to what Steve said about what can I do on the ground from here to there? Am I going to be able to make,
make
a
change.
significant improvement, or am I just going to keep swirling the drain and trying to play catch up the whole way?
Right. And, we're going to talk about time here in a second. Um, but one of the things that I learned very early on as a medic intern was from my father-in-law, and he said BLS providers, when you're a BLS provider, you get off the scene fairly quickly because it's not the like critical patient. You're not going to stay and play. You're gonna like rapid transport, right? Because you don't have the tools to resuscitate and make them better on scene. Whereas then you transition to an ALS provider and now you're given a bunch more resuscitory tools. So you see a critical patient on scene, you might stay there a little bit longer to do that resuscitation. So the roles are reversed, right? So like the alpha stub toe, as a paramedic, I'm gonna rapid transport that because I want to get back in service, right? But the hemodynamically unstable shock patient, I'm gonna stay playing a little bit to make sure they can transition into the transport. And we forget that the flight teams are doing the same thing. They're going to slow down, they're going to stay and play for a little bit, they're going to get all their tools together, and then they're going to start the resuscitating process. Do they need an airway? Do they need to RSI? Do they need to do, resuscitation before they do that and then get in the helicopter and go? You know,
Right. It's not like they just hook their stuff up and take the patient out of the ambulance and put them on theirs without doing an assessment,
right.
doing an intervention that they might need to do. Am I wrong, Em?
No, you got it 100% correct.
Gosh.
Sometimes it's different for ground crews depending on, their education background and like how they were trained to do certain things. But, they might not be doing what you think they need to be doing or what you think they should have been doing, but like they're on a totally different set of guidelines. So
Mhm.
like I know I had this conversation with one of ground paramedics in the last few months, and they're like, oh, well, I was going to do this, this, and this. And I was like, that's a great idea. Like, yes, 100%. But that's like, we can go 10 steps beyond that. And like, the collaborative isn't really matching with what I think is going on with this patient. And I think that's the difference. I think from EMT to paramedic to flight provider, if you want to call it a ladder, I don't really think it's a ladder. But when you talk about the basic level to the advanced level, like, you're trained to think further ahead and you're trained to think further down the line. So I think that that comes into effect.
Yeah. So, I want to have a quick conversation because I want to get to my last thing, and I don't want to hold Steve here all day. Um, I want to have a conversation about time and utilization. So, one of the things that I noticed is, we have a patient that, you know, I go back to we'll use the hemodynamically unstable. Hey, there's an unstable patient. I don't know if I'm going to be able to manage them for, 2 hours to the ER, or even 45 minutes or whatnot to the ER. So I'm going to call for the aircraft to come in to make that transport a little bit quicker. But I think the pitfall that we get into as ground clinicians is we only focus on the time that it takes for the aircraft to get to me to save me. We forget that there's a shutting down time, there's a on scene time, there's a load time, and then there's the flight back to a hospital. So, and you guys might disagree with me. Totally fine. I've been wrong before. If you guys, if you are within definitive care, you're going to a stroke center, a comprehensive for, whatever, or you're going for trauma that might be really bad, but they're not hemodynamically unstable, right? They don't need blood. Are you gonna and you're say 30 minutes away from definitive care, a level 1, level 2 trauma center, or a stroke center that's not a primary, right? Comprehensive stroke center. Is it worth the time to wait for that aircraft to, fly in 15 minutes plus lift, do their assessment, do their load, and then fly the 10, 12, 15 minutes to a hospital? Or is it just easier and better for the patient to get them to definitive care? Now, again, this is going to be situational because I'll tell you, I'll wait for blood if it's going to get them to the ER, right? I'll wait for certain things if I'm an hour and a half away and my flight time is still going to be a half hour shorter than how I could drive them there. What are your guys' kind of thoughts on this? I know this is not a black and white answer. I'm just kind of looking for thoughts because I know a lot of people think time always, but then there's always the occasions where we wait on scene when we could be moving towards a closer LZ and saving that time, or, delaying patient care, definitive patient care, because we could have been there before they land, right? And we're waiting 25 minutes for them to land, right? So what are your guys' thoughts on that?
So I really want to hear Emily's thoughts from the critical care provider side, not just the guy who stares at Excel spreadsheets and has high level conversation side. The one thing
However, you
and
sound very
basically
smart,
mentioned it.
Steve. So
I've been practicing. Thanks so much. The one thing I want to point out that you said that's really important is, you really shouldn't be waiting, right? I mean, New York State protocol says as much. Now, obviously, I think, the average provider has a maturity to understand, you know, that doesn't mean, start ground pounding and avoid the helicopter because there's a 4-minute time to intercept. I don't think that's the spirit of the policy protocol, policy statement, whatever the case may be. But I think generally speaking, it goes back to the idea that there really should be some local engagement and training, both within your squad and with your air medical providers. Your first time figuring that out should not be with a real patient, right? Just like any other skill, it's something you should be practicing. And a lot of providers utilize like pre-designated landing zones. I think that's a huge, huge, huge benefit for these areas, because particularly in the event of these time-sensitive, hemodynamically unstable patients, uh, the more efficient, the better, right? Like at the end of the day, we're talking about efficiency and access. Uh, you shouldn't be sitting around waiting, right? Like generally speaking, there's probably a reasonable means to say, okay, because we've done the work on the back end, on the front end, and we set up the, pre-designated landing zones, we understand that we have that relationship with the critical access hospital that we can move towards them. And if the timing works out, simply hand off care at the helipad rather than at the ER where they may not have the resources to stabilize that patient meaningfully. There are ways to work in unison for a really good outcome for the patient that are accessible. Whether it's, loading up those addresses into the Google Maps or the CAD or whatever the case may be, such that everyone's on the same page and it's accessible, it's shared knowledge. And, your last landing zone class, you practice doing that based off of the, fake scene response. There are ways to do it such that it's accessible, it's efficient, and it's patient outcome centric. That's the point, right? Like none of this should be done on the fly, no pun intended. If we put in a little work on the front end to make sure that we've considered these specialty patient populations, right? Ultimately, we're talking about the most fragile patients that we're going to interact with, whether it's a trauma patient or just some profoundly critically ill patient from, internal bleeding, whatever the case may be, the occlusion. Like, why wouldn't we invest just a little time as a system to protect those people and to empower the people that are responding to take care of them? Let's figure out those landing zones. Let's figure out, okay, for my service in this fire district, like what's the best practice of intercept, right? We can make pretty good hypothesis on, for this agency's response area, what does the timeline look like for the first due helicopter to get here? What does the timeline look like for the second due helicopter? Is there a third due within reasonable response area? Or at that point, are we ground pound, right? Like none of this is some crazy mystery or, math problem that's out of reach. Again, a few conversations and a little time, all this is really accessible. And these are high level decisions that can be figured out well in advance, such that the paramedic or the EMT are treating the patient and not all the logistical problems that go with it. To that point, probably don't wait for a helicopter. Again, 30 seconds, 3 minutes when we're talking about an hour ground transport versus sitting around 20 minutes when, a reasonable hospital facility is the same distance away. That's easy math to do. We can figure out, we understand what's reasonable and what's prudent. And there's really good, debrief and education opportunities to address any failures there that come up or any opportunities for improvement. I think that's super critical on the back end. And I'm sure your local program will be more than happy to help those conversations. But ultimately, I think it comes down to what is the time to intercept? Are we going in the direction of the hospital? Because the answer should be yes, as your backup plan. And what's the expected outcome for that patient? Are there tools there that are going to make a difference? Can I meet them along the way? Or am I chasing a means to an end rather than a really good outcome?
Right. What do you have to add to that?
It's funny that you asked this question because I have done a call that two patients from the same scene, one went with me and one went by ground, and the ground beat us to the hospital.
Nice.
Dang.
As the provider, I'm there to help and to provide care, and the care was provided. So, like, to me, that's kind of my job. That's where I stop. I don't, I'm happy that I got the flight. I thought it was a great flight. I mean,
she's just happy to fly.
literally, like, I'm just excited to not sit in the building for the winter. Like, I'm so excited for summer to come. But I do think that you brought up a really good point, Tarek, that it's not when you feel relief, it's for the patient's relief. And like, I think that providers sometimes forget about that, that there is a whole nother leg of that patient interaction with a provider that has to happen before definitive care And yes, there's different tools and different meds and, different things being done, but I think it's something worth remembering.
Mm-hmm. I've worked in numerous different systems where you have definitive care, in all different types of, locations and distances. And, it still shocks me that there are numerous times, like it happens so frequently that like I can't ignore it, that, your definitive care is 15 to 18 minutes away, and they're spending an hour on scene waiting for the helicopter, loading, doing all this other stuff when you could have been there and been back before you get this patient to the hospital via air. And it's like, I think, and that's why I brought up, I think we only think about the safety net of like, it's here for me and it's not here for my patient. What's better for them? Like I could be uncomfortable for 25 minutes and get them there, within reason. Like, again, I'm going to wait for certain things, like I had this conversation with my wife, and, if they're hemodynamically unstable and from a trauma and they need blood or they're going to code, I'm going to start driving towards an LZ so I can get blood. Maybe I wait for them for 10 minutes, but guess what? They're going to get something that they need that's going to make them better before I can drive the 30 minutes to the ER. Right. Um, so I,
I
I
will
think,
to piggyback off of that. Sorry, not to interrupt.
no, go.
One of the biggest things one of the big things that I learned when I started flying, which I did not realize because of where I worked EMS over here. People pick up the flight crew and all of their equipment and put them in an ambulance and go to the hospital all the time. And like I get the benefit and the negative of it, right? Like if you don't have the weather to get up or whatever the case may be, like we're still there, my brain is still functioning, and I still have all the tools that I have on that aircraft. So like don't, maybe they can't fly. If you have to pass a base or something, give them a call and be like, hey, if we meet you in 20 minutes, can you come?
And I couldn't tell you how many times that happens with my wife. The just, hey, you know what? We need you, but we're gonna stop at where your base is. And it's like, okay, well, now they have an option. They either load the patient into the aircraft and take them from there, or they ground and pound with them, so yeah, it is I remember calling my wife because she was on the uh on call that day, and I was going to an MVA that sounded awful, and I was like, I'm in between hospitals and you are my closest, like we're going to need blood and interventions. Put yourself on standby because I might see you in 15 minutes. And she's like, okay, cool. Didn't end up happening. There was, it ended up, being a no patient actually. But there
Okay.
literally was no person there. They ran off into the woods. So we never saw a human being.
Like,
Um,
huh, okay.
but
Yeah.
like just having those operational thoughts, is, and I think it comes down to, again, what's available and what's trained and what's taught to these people. Like for the longest time, I didn't know where the LZs were in my district because that was a fire problem. Like I didn't set them, I just ask, and then my driver gets me there or the fire department gets me there. But like it really is important to know where the bases are, how far away each one is, who's first up, like those types of things really help your operational thought processes as a provider, because I can go, okay, this aircraft is coming from behind me and I could be at the hospital in front of me before they get to my scene. I'm going to go that direction. And I might ask, is there another aircraft available ahead of me? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But, if you don't know where they're coming from, you can't make those decisions. So I think the learning your own operational aspect is a big key of being able to make the decisions. Um,
I think I want to comment on the time thing. And this could be a huge generalization and I could be wrong. But if you're sitting on a landing zone, at a landing zone, waiting for a helicopter to land, and you find, or like on the way, you're thinking about what am I going to do while I'm waiting? And you find that you're twiddling your thumbs and you're not doing, like, there's not an intervention for you to do. You don't need to resuscitate this person. You don't need to make them, more hemodynamically stable. Then maybe you can just drive it.
And I think it should be intercept time, right? Not wait time, realistically. Again, especially if we're doing like a healthy auto standby where, theoretically en route, you already know if there's an aircraft available, what their ETA is or would be if you accept them. And, it ends up matching that initial dispatch criteria as far as acuity. Like anything else, it's no different than any other clinical modality, right? Like you should have your plan A, your plan B, and your plan C in your head, whether it's a physical intervention, drug you're going to be giving if plan A doesn't work out or what have you. Same thing, right? Like generally speaking, unless you're really out there, you're probably moving towards a landing zone, unless there's some sort of prolonged entrapment or other scenario there. So it should be idle time, right? Like you should otherwise be doing resuscitation, stabilization, and preferably in the back of the ambulance when reasonable en route to a
Yeah.
landing zone. The idea of waiting in one spot makes me nervous, right? Like that's probably not a good use of time. Uh, every situation is different. That's not to say there's no scenario where you're hanging on tight for the helicopter to come in. Um, but I keep that in mind, right? It should be planned just like any other modality at your disposal. And the sooner you know the ETA, the sooner you can make an informed decision about how to maximize that efficiency, right? If it's 15 minutes, whatever, it's going to take that long to get them, stabilized on the monitor, in the reeves, carried out with you and all your closest friends and your 511 tack pants, and then on the way to the landing zone. But when we're talking, when you're further out, that might change your decision making. And it is 100% appropriate to say, hey, this math doesn't math. It does not make sense to sit here and wait or like go out of our way away from the hospital to a pre-designated landing zone to intercept when I have this resource this time away. There are times where even in my practice, I've said, okay, this isn't going to work for me. Send them over to XYZ hospital. If they're there when I get there, great. I'm going to meet them at the helipad instead of going in through the magical ER doors. And then if it works out, fantastic. If it doesn't, okay. Plan B is I'm going through the ER and handing it off there. And then worst case scenario, they get some friends in their work pajamas coming in to help when it turns into an interfacility transport.
Yep. Yeah.
So again, if we plan these things out like we would any other aspect of response to a high acuity call, it's accessible, right?
So the only thing that I will add to the whole training aspect of like, hey, let's talk to agencies and groups and fire departments and all that is I also think that we should be talking to businesses as well, right? Because there are certain businesses that we might take over a portion of their parking lot or a portion of their field or whatever for an LZ. And then, you're ready to rear in and like, hey, I'm going to use it. And you get there and there's no LZ because they're using it. There's a giant snowbank on it, or they didn't plow it, or whatever. And now we as clinicians have to figure out, well, what the fuck do we do now? I definitely think that, in terms of like, if we're gonna do training, also open it up to the community side of things. If we are gonna be utilizing like, oh, hey, we want to use a golf course's parking lot or something. Hey guys, just know that this might happen, I remember being at there was a hospital that I frequented quite often, and their helipad was actually part of their parking lot. But their employees would park cars in said parking lot all the time. So I would go down there for a transfer to pick up the flight crew, and the flight crew couldn't actually get there because there's 20 cars across the parking lot. And now security's got to come down, everything gets delayed, they're sitting there doing circles, and it's just madness. So like we should, agencies and local providers should, air medical and the local people should all be having those discussions as well. But I think the last thing that I want to get into, and again, you and I had talked previously, Steve, so I don't know how specific you can get into these, but I know you're a numbers cruncher kind of guy. I want to talk about, and we don't have to go a lot in depth, but there is still a really hard beef on air medical for cost, right? Helicopters are multi-million dollar machines, right? The operation of them, fuel cost, upkeep, mechanics, everything is really expensive. And for eons and eons, the thing is with all the salty curmudgeons out there that I'm not making my patient, $80,000 in debt because I called a helicopter. And people latch on to that. And I couldn't tell you how many times, you know, my wife goes to a PR or something and somebody comes up and is like, how expensive is it? I'm not calling you guys because it's too damn expensive. And it's like, well, my argument to that is because I had an administrator one time who was like, you will not call because I don't want them to have this cost. And I'm like, but I will because I don't listen to you. No longer work there, but whatever. My argument to that was, well, if I take them and they go to the ICU, they're getting charged like $60,000 a day to be there. So what's the difference? Right? Should I just not take them to the hospital at all? That'll save them cost. It's only like 10 grand for a funeral nowadays. So what is like the generic costs of flight, maybe like operationally versus like what is a patient going to absorb? Of course, again, we can't know for sure, but like ballpark it for people listening.
Yeah, so I think the first thing, it's important to acknowledge that there was a lot of bad behavior in air medical billing, right? These people who are, being patient advocates because that's what we should be first is whether you're an EMT, paramedic, firefighter, like we're taught, especially me from my preceptors when I was in paramedic school, like we're taught that a lot of times, like we are the people who are equipped to sort of speak truth to power in defense of that patient for whatever vulnerability may exist. And back in the day when people were staring down the barrel of tens of thousands of dollars of debt for which they were accountable for a helicopter ride, like I think it's important to acknowledge like that's serious, right? People generally don't have tens of thousands of dollars burning a hole in their pocket, ready to go, even if the trade-off is their life, right? That being said, a number of things have happened in the industry over recent years that are really critical to this question. The very short version that's sort of true for all air medical providers, regardless of philosophy or practice, is the No Surprises Act. That bill isn't relevant for ground billing at this point. It is for air medical and for a lot of like, hospital-based procedures. But the very short version of that is for patients who are insured. Out of network doesn't really mean anything as far as their culpability. At the end of the day, more often than not, when you're looking at a patient who's being flown by an air medical asset, they're going to end up paying their copay deductible, right? Same as you would for a ground ambulance bill. You see that scary EOB that says, you took a ride in an ALS ambulance for, 2 miles and now the assigned cost is $4,000. No, you're not paying $4,000 as an insured individual, right? You're paying the copay deductible for transport. The same thing is true now in the helicopter world. A lot of providers out there are able to provide some sort of like assistance in navigating that process. But the days of like catastrophic bills are just not a thing anymore. There's not a scenario where your insurance says, I'm going to pay the air medical vendor X dollars and you're left holding the bag.
Yeah.
That's not it. It's your copay, it's your deductible. But with that, I mean, it's an important consideration, right? Like I'm sure probably all of us on this call have been on a scene mission where, we're waiting for an air crew to come in And whether it's the patient who's alert enough to have the conversation, or the family members there, or even another provider from the public safety realm, where we activate that helicopter and you see the sphincter tone just go, right? Also like, oh wait, I don't want the bill. I can't afford this, or they can't afford this. They've got X, Y, and Z challenges, and that puts us in a bad position as clinicians, right? That doesn't make you feel warm and fuzzy, like you've got all this going wrong, such that you're calling a helicopter, trying to like do right by the patient. And now, in addition to juggling, fentanyl or the medications, all everything else, now it's like I have to have a financial conversation too. That's not comfortable. That's not good. It's not efficient. So part of that training should be having like an open, honest conversation of, hey, what does it look like once we hand this patient off to your helicopter and they transport them? Like, what's the culpability there? I think people will be pleasantly surprised by the answers. Um, Again, with the No Surprises Act, that does an incredible amount to protect patients from what used to be called balance billing, right? Where insurance paid what they thought was the appropriate in-network share, whatever the case may be, and then patient was left holding the bag. That's a lot of what those conversations are about, like the huge costs for the patients, and that simply isn't the case anymore. Um, have the conversations. Your provider should be pretty open. Again, a lot of the billing specific to patient is HIPAA covered
Mhm.
information, right? So they may not be able to say, well, in the case of Joe Bob, the cost was X, Y, Z, and here's why. But they should be able to give you a really thoughtful overview of what their activity looks like and what that process looks like to protect those patients from, like, round two of trauma from whatever incident led them to meet in the first place.
Yeah, and I want to say Gerard had said it on one previous show, that he flew a patient and then later on took the same patient ALS, and they were talking, about like how they did with the helicopter and stuff like that. And uh, the patient actually said, like, yeah, a while after was like, yeah, my last ambulance bill was actually more expensive than my aircraft bill. And I was like, Gerard told me that. I think he said it on the show one of the 5 years we've been doing this. And I was like, what? Like, nobody ever thinks like that anymore. And when you go back and, you do 5 minutes of research, you find out that all of those like catastrophic bills where people are getting their houses taken and this, that, the other thing, it's because they didn't pay their medical bills and instead bought a boat or went on
Your
vacation
truck.
or whatever. And more often than not, you're like, well, if you paid your bill, like
Right.
that the insurance company gave you the money for, the news story wouldn't have a news story. Um,
And again, I think that it
Again,
comes down to,
small population
did you
was the
fall
thing,
between the
but
cracks, or did you get swept between the cracks, right? I don't think the insurers, unanimously decided to send, reimbursement checks directly to the patient rather than the vendor on accident,
right,
right? There's
right.
legislation in New York State, I believe, I'll have to look, I think it went into effect that, requires insurers to now remit payment directly to the provider for that reason.
Yes.
That's good.
Yeah. That went in,
Yeah.
I want to say last year because it was in my new last year's EMT slides. So
Right.
it's
They
been
voted it in, but I think it was
recent-ish.
going to be like, 12, 15 months before it took effect.
Yeah.
So
Uh,
I'll have to spend a little time on Google after that just to verify that it made it all the way through. But again, I think at the end of the day, like, you should be able to have like an open, honest conversation with your provider about what that looks like. Um, Education's important. Get it right from the source. Call up your local base and be like, hey, when are we doing the in-person training? Let's look at our landing zone footprint in this area. Let's make sure we're all mutually up to date on what the ground agency has as far as modalities today and what the air agency has and how those complement each other, right? And then add in the conversation of like, hey, once we utilize you guys, how is that patient supported in that billing process? Because you should, I know in my area, like when I call, I am, and again, I have the good fortune of seeing behind the curtain and working on like the logistics side of the air medical world in my day job, but I am totally confident today, regardless of what vendor I get in New York State, when I'm handing out that patient, I know they're going to be good hands. They're not going to be, financially ruined because I made the decision clinically that they needed a higher level of care that I could not reasonably provide to them. I know, like, half the time it seems the hardest part is getting them to answer the phone because they see, the 800 number or the, some out of state number. And then, first thing you do is like, oh, my car's extended warranty's expired. Hang up, block, don't write, don't call. And then next thing you know, you get some big scary EOB and then the conversation starts. But
Right. So, Emily, anything to add on to that? I think Steve.
Go familiarize yourself with your local air medical. They want to see you. You want to see them. Go hang out. Have fun.
So, in closing, does anybody have any like last thoughts, questions, comments, thoughts? Steve, anything that you want the public to know about air medical? Emily, anything you want them to know? Megan, do you have a question? Any last words before I give it to Emily to sign off here? Yeah, your husband invented the sign off, so you get it when Gerard's not here. No, the silence is deafening. All right. All right. Well, Emily, take it away then.
Oh, nuts.
All right. That's where we're going to have to leave it for this episode. If you got something out of this, education, validation, or just a comforting reminder that you're not the only one dealing with this nonsense, do us a favor and follow or subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And don't stop here. Go queue up another episode. There's a good chance we already said something that will either make you better or make you mad enough to think about it on your next shift. This has been the Medic Materials Podcast. Real EMS conversations, zero corporate polish, and education that actually applies at 3 in the morning. You can find CMEs, merch, and everything else we're building over at medic-materials.com. Until next time, stay safe, eat a donut, and please, for the love of God, answer your QA flags.